Vice Chairman of the Task Force, Mr. Pittenger of North Carolina, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Lynch, and certainly thank Chairman Henschling and Ranking Member Waters for their leadership as well. Thank you for your continued dedication on this important assignment to track terrorism financing. Technical assistance is an important concept that attempts to integrate developing countries into the legitimate network of global financial institutions. When implemented properly, in theory, technical assistance can open markets in developing countries, offering new investment opportunities and generating economic growth. This hearing is an important step for this task force to determine the effectiveness of technical assistance in developing countries, especially with regard to staving off terrorism financing. It is essential that this task force learn what works, what doesn't, and what Congress can do to improve this initiative. For example, I am interested in exploring whether or not technical assistance for economic crimes could be expanded or merged with resources, including asset forfeitures and other foreign aid that we have provided to so many countries around the world. In Turkey, the United States has provided an average of $10 million a year for the past decade in foreign aid. This is in addition to the vast amount of foreign military sales we provide to Turkey. What if some of these dollars and programs became tied to combating economic crimes in Turkey and creating additional accountability regarding terror financing? Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask, do you believe that these special assistance efforts should be tied to foreign aid that we give these countries?
Yeah, speaking from the multilateral side, I think on a technical assistance issue like this, tying it would not be very productive. But I think the point that's been made consistently about ensuring that the governments are committed to doing something about it is the key determining variable. I'd also say, to build on Mr. Lowry's point, that there's broad interest in this across the donor community. So in terms of mobilizing resources, one would not only in most countries be looking simply at the U.S., but looking across the donor community to put in place and to support a program. If I could, just to come back to Mr. Lynch's point, I think if you look at Africa and central banks in Africa, it's true there are weaknesses, but there's a world of difference from when I started working on Africa 40 years ago. And I think the capacity and the commitment of governments to commit to a better financial system, to commit to central banks that are independent and work across Africa, is beginning to make progress. In a case like Somalia, where there isn't basic security, but I think the fact is we're still struggling with mechanisms. And in fact, this week in the bank is Fragile State Week, where people working on Fragile State are gathering together to try to figure out mechanisms to provide support in situations where basic security doesn't exist. And I think those are challenges which really still complicate and make very difficult the donor community activities.
Should we be targeting our resources toward countries that maintain poor FATF ratings? The countries that have poor FATF ratings, should we be targeting our resources toward these countries?
Well, I think we should. And again, I think I would make raising that FATF rating obviously the responsibility of the host government, but I would hope that every ambassador and every country desk officer here in the States has that on their to-do list as something that is a priority for us. Right now, I'm not sure that it would be quite as high as some of the other political or security objectives, even though I think it is a classic security objective.
Does Treasury have FATF ratings on their radar screen when they're implementing this technical assistance?
Don't know that. Again, I've been gone now 7 years. I was kept as Deputy Secretary very closely briefed by Stuart Levy, Danny Glazer, and their team on the FATF process, the FATF ratings. When I would meet with visiting people, largely from finance ministers and central banks, we would talk about that. I'm sure it is current in the TFI office, Terrorism Financial Intelligence Office, Treasury more broadly. I don't know, Mr. Pittenger.
You know, there's always a pay for in these efforts. As we look at a means to pay for, is Are asset forfeitures a means that we can go to? Is there any restrictions or reason why that could not be a resource for paying for implementing this?
I'm sorry, I just don't know. I know that there's been a lot of legislation considered, some passed recently, that have allowed certain classes of people to get at certain asset forfeitures. Mostly they were people who were prisoners or families of people who were killed in terrorist attacks. For this specific purpose, I just don't know what the authority would be. I think it's certainly something that would bear exploring, because frankly, I think sometimes we're better at seizing assets and penalizing banks than we are getting to the root cause of what the problem is, as Mr. Lowry also said in his testimony.
In my discussions with President El-Sisi, for example, I found that he was very eager to be in compliant with our efforts in tracking the money, but he certainly lacked the resources to facilitate what we need to get done. He has extraordinary concerns throughout his country. How do you believe that we should be assessing and targeting how we fund and support these efforts for countries like Egypt? How much of a priority should that be for us?
I think it should be a very high priority. I think the key question is not only, as you suggested, where are the gaps between what their requirements are under the FATF rules and where their actual regime is, but going back to a comment that many of us have made, what is their willingness, their commitment to true reform? And where you have those two things meeting, then we should be very much involved in helping them get where they need to get. The challenge often is when there's a gap, and when the host country is not very committed, then we're in a challenge. And sometimes our desire, we want it more than they do, and that's a recipe for failure.
Well, in this instance, what I sensed was somebody who wanted to be fully engaged, but we were not there in their behalf. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time is expired.